Hello and welcome. Today we are diving into a topic that is just, well, absolutely essential if you want to understand the political story of 20th century India. We're talking about Muhammad Ali Jinnah's 14 points. Now, if you're studying modern Indian history, particularly for competitive exams, you know this is a big one. You got to get this right. So let's kick things off with the big question that looms over this entire discussion. Were these 14 points a practical, workable blueprint for protecting a minority within a united India? Or were they something else? Did they mark a point of no return, a line in the sand that would shape the conflicts for years to come? That's exactly what we're going to explore.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll set the stage and look at the context. Why did these demands even come up? Then, we'll get into the real nitty-gritty, the question of political representation. After that, we'll see how the points tried to future-proof the Constitution itself. Then we'll cover the demands for protecting culture and religion, and finally, we'll wrap it all up with a really clear summary so you've got all the key takeaways.
To really get a handle on this, you have to understand that these points didn't just appear out of thin air. Not at all. They were a direct response to the intense political debates happening in the late 1920s about what an independent India should even look like.
The real trigger, the immediate spark, was the Nehru Report of 1928. Now, this report, mostly driven by the Indian National Congress, laid out a vision for a constitution with a very powerful central government. But, and this is a huge but, from the Muslim League's perspective, it basically ignored the protections they felt were absolutely vital for minorities. So the 14 points weren't just some counteroffer, they were a completely different vision. They became the Muslim League's non-negotiable bottom line.
So that brings us to the first major theme. At the absolute heart of the 14 points was this deep concern about getting a real, effective political voice for the Muslim community in a country where, demographically, they would be in the minority.
And this right here is probably the most famous demand of them all. A minimum, and that word is key, a minimum of 1/3 of all seats in the central legislature had to go to Muslims. This wasn't just some random number they plucked out of the air. It was seen as the bare minimum they needed to make sure their voice wasn't just drowned out on every single issue at the national level.
But it didn't stop there. The demand for representation went into every corner of government. First, at the provincial level, they wanted representation based on population. But then, and this is crucial, they also demanded that at least 1/3 of all ministers in every cabinet, central and provincial, had to be Muslim. And they took it even further into the bureaucracy itself, demanding a fair share of all government jobs. The thinking was, it's not enough to just make the laws. You need to be there to implement them too.
And then we come to this really critical concept, separate electorates. So what does that actually mean? Well, it was a system where Muslim voters would only vote for Muslim candidates. The logic behind it was pretty straightforward. They wanted to make sure that Muslim leaders were accountable only to their own community and wouldn't have to water down their positions to win votes from the majority community. Okay, so the next set of points, this is where things get really interesting. They weren't just thinking about the present. They were trying to build long-term safeguards into the system. It was literally an attempt to future-proof the Constitution so that a majority couldn't just change the rules down the line. You can really feel the anxiety here. The core fear was, okay, what if we get all these protections now, but then 20 years after independence, a parliament dominated by the majority just decides to amend the Constitution and get rid of them? So you see, these next demands were all about creating permanent shields that couldn't be easily dismantled. And two specific demands really aimed at this fear. First, a ban on redrawing provincial borders, what we might call gerrymandering today, if it would weaken the Muslim majority in key provinces like Punjab and Bengal. Second, and this is a big one, a huge check on central power. No constitutional amendment could pass without the provinces themselves agreeing to it. That's a serious commitment to a federal structure.
This brings us to what was probably the single most powerful and, let's be honest, controversial safeguard that was demanded. It was a mechanism that's often been called the communal veto, and it was designed to be the ultimate shield for any community, not just Muslims. And this chart does a great job of showing you just how much power this veto would have. Here's how it would work. If any bill came up in any legislature that affected a specific community, that bill could not pass if 3/4, that's 75%, of that community's elected representatives voted against it. So think about it. Even if a bill had overwhelming support in the legislature as a whole, just a fraction of representatives from one community could stop it in its tracks.
Okay, let's move on to the final set of demands. Here, the focus shifts a little bit away from pure political power and more towards preserving cultural and religious identity.
This was all about making sure the community's entire way of life was protected by the state.
So, these points called for a constitutional guarantee of full religious freedom for everybody. But they also went further, seeking very specific protections for Muslim identity, things like safeguarding their culture, their personal law or Sharia, and making sure the state would actively promote Muslim education and the Urdu language. It was about creating a protected space for a distinct culture inside the larger nation.
Whew, okay, we've gone through a lot of detail there, so let's just take a step back and pull it all together into a simple, easy-to-digest summary.
This table really just lays it out perfectly. You can basically see the 3 pillars of the 14 points. First, representation, getting a strong political voice. Second, safeguards, building permanent constitutional shields against the majority. And third, culture, protecting a unique religious and cultural identity. These were the fundamental ideas that would really dominate the political debate for the entire next decade.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. By putting all of these demands on the table as one consolidated and mostly non-negotiable package, how did these 14 points completely change the conversation, the level of trust, and, in the end, the final outcome of India's long road to independence? It's a question historians still argue about, and you can't even begin to have that argument without understanding these 14 points. Thanks for joining us.